Disclaimer: this story contains mature themes intended for adult viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. The glass was still cold against my lips when I heard the sound, the slow creak of the kitchen door. I froze. A drop of water slid down my throat as I turned my head just enough to see him standing there, one shoulder resting lazily against the wall, eyes tracing every line of me like he had been waiting for this exact moment. For a second, neither of us moved. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, a quiet, electric buzz between two people pretending they weren't caught off guard. My pulse thudded against my skin, heat rising to my face as his gaze finally lifted, slow, deliberate, locking with mine. I swallowed, throat tight. "You could have knocked," I said, though my voice betrayed me with its soft, uneven tone. He didn't answer, just tilted his head, the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. "Would you have wanted me to?" His voice was low, steady, too calm for what was happening in his eyes. I turned back toward the counter, pretending to take another sip, pretending not to notice how close his footsteps were getting. But when I set the glass down, I could feel him behind me, close enough that the warmth of his breath ghosted against my shoulder. A shiver ran through me before I could stop it. My fingers brushed the counter's edge, searching for something to hold on to. "You always drink water this late?" he asked quietly. "Sometimes," I whispered, not trusting myself to turn around. His silence stretched between us, charged and breathless. Then, gently, so gently, it happened. His hand brushed against mine, an accidental touch that didn't feel accidental at all. The glass trembled slightly, the faint clink echoing like a heartbeat in the still kitchen. I could feel his eyes still on me, steady, unblinking, daring me to look back. And just when I did, the sound of a phone buzzed sharply from the next room, slicing through the air like reality itself had decided to step in. I inhaled, my chest tight, and turned fully toward him, finally meeting the look that had been holding me hostage. Her pulse hadn't slowed even after he left the kitchen that night. She leaned back against the counter, tracing the rim of her glass absent-mindedly, trying to convince herself that nothing had happened, that it was just a fleeting moment. But her mind refused to cooperate. Every detail, the way he had tilted his head, the faint smile tugging at his lips, the subtle warmth of his hand against hers, replayed in her head like a film on loop. It hadn't always been this way between them. For months, they had skirted around each other's boundaries, careful, polite, almost like roommates sharing a space that belonged to someone else. She remembered the first time she noticed him really looking at her, not just seeing her, but seeing her. It was in the living room, sunlight catching the soft curve of her shoulder as she laughed at a silly joke he made. She had felt exposed, vulnerable, and yet oddly alive, as if his gaze had unlocked a part of her she had kept hidden even from herself. There were cracks in their relationship, subtle but persistent. Words left unsaid, apologies never voiced, glances that lingered too long. She had told herself that desire wasn't real, that it was simply a product of too much proximity and too many quiet nights. But each small interaction, the accidental brush of his hand, the way he sometimes stayed just a second too long when they crossed paths, hinted at something more, something dangerous yet irresistible. And he, too, carried unspoken truths. She sensed it in the moments he would disappear for hours, returning with that quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken. He watched her, really watched her, with a hunger that was both respectful and impatient. It was a tension that neither had named, a magnetic pull they both pretended not to notice. Yet in that kitchen, that night, the pretense had cracked. She thought about all the times she had almost said something, nearly reached out to bridge the distance. And he? She imagined he had done the same, holding back, weighing desire against the fear of ruining what little normalcy they had. And now, standing in the memory of that charged silence, she realized how long they had been circling each other, teasing fate and themselves. Her heart still raced as she touched the counter, fingers lingering on the cool surface, remembering the warmth of his hand. There was an undeniable pull between them, a line drawn in tension, curiosity, and longing. One night, one fleeting moment, had changed everything, but neither of them knew how far that change would reach. And just like that, the kitchen wasn't just a room anymore. It was the space where everything unspoken between them had begun to unravel, leaving her breathless, on edge, and wondering what would happen next. The days that followed were unbearable in their quiet, unspoken way. Every time he laughed a little too close to someone else, she felt a pang, a sharp, unwanted sting of jealousy that made her chest tighten. She chastised herself silently. It's ridiculous. But the fluttering in her stomach betrayed her rational mind. And him? He wasn't immune either. She caught the subtle tension in his gaze when she lingered a little too long on her phone, typing messages that weren't meant for him, or when she casually mentioned someone else in passing. There was a flicker in his eyes, an almost imperceptible twitch in his jaw, that spoke of possessiveness he tried to mask. It was as if the air between them had become combustible. Every brush of hands, every accidental touch, set off a chain reaction that neither could control. One evening, she found herself in the living room, bending to pick up a book that had slipped, only to feel his presence behind her. Too close. Too warm. You shouldn't leave things lying around, he murmured, his voice low, almost teasing. Her heartbeat jumped, a mix of irritation and thrill. I suppose I should let you handle everything then, she replied, trying to mask her trembling pulse with playful defiance. He smiled, but there was a hunger behind it, restrained yet undeniably present. Maybe I should, he said, stepping slightly closer, narrowing the distance between them. Her fingers grazed the edge of the table, steadying herself as the magnetic pull between them grew stronger, heavier. She wanted to tell him to stop, but even as she thought it, part of her hoped he wouldn't. The tension in the room was thick, the kind that pressed against your skin, filling your lungs with anticipation. Their eyes met, unblinking, daring each other to take the next step. And in that charged silence, there was a promise of something forbidden, something neither of them could fully resist. Every nerve in her body screamed that she shouldn't, that she had to step back, yet she remained rooted, captivated by the unspoken pull between them. One move, one look, and the world would shift, yet neither of them had the courage to act, not yet. The screen fades with her glancing over her shoulder at him, lips slightly parted, heart racing, leaving viewers on the edge of discovering what happens next. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against her skin and made every sound, every breath, every creak of the floorboards, feel amplified. She knew he was home, somewhere nearby, but neither had spoken since dinner. And yet, the tension between them was electric, impossible to ignore. She walked to the kitchen to get a glass of water, only to find him already there. He hadn't moved from the counter, leaning against it casually, but his gaze pinned her in place. You're up late, he said softly. She swallowed, trying to steady her racing heartbeat. I couldn't sleep. The words hung in the air, meaningless on the surface, but weighted with everything they hadn't said over the past weeks. She felt the pull between them, magnetic and undeniable, drawing her closer despite herself. He stepped a fraction closer as she reached for a glass, their hands brushing slightly. It was a tiny touch, almost accidental, but it made her shiver. She could feel his presence like heat radiating toward her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, warm and familiar. You always come here alone, he asked, voice low, teasing, but edged with something more, something urgent. I like it when it's quiet, she murmured, and their eyes locked. The kitchen felt smaller, closer, the air thick with anticipation. Every glance, every subtle shift in posture made it impossible to pretend there wasn't something building between them. Her pulse thundered in her ears as he moved a step closer, the space between them shrinking. She wanted to step back, but her legs wouldn't obey. Her fingers trembled slightly on the glass, the cool condensation contrasting sharply with the warmth radiating from him. They stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Every second stretched, charged with unspoken longing, the kind of tension that makes the air feel almost alive. Then, just as he leaned forward, closer than ever, there was a sudden knock at the door. Both of them froze, the spell broken, and she spun toward the sound, heart hammering. His gaze lingered on her for a heartbeat longer, a silent promise unspoken, before the knock echoed again. The screen cuts to black. The knock at the door had shattered the charged quiet, but it didn't fully break the tension. She froze mid-step, glass still in hand, as he stepped slightly closer, his presence a shield and a spark all at once. "I'll get it," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, the sound trembling with adrenaline. He didn't move, didn't speak, simply watched her with an intensity that made her pulse race. Every step she took toward the door felt like a decision she wasn't fully ready to make, and yet impossible to resist. When she opened it, the air outside was heavy with a chill, carrying a scent of rain that made the room feel even smaller, even more intimate. On the doorstep stood someone she hadn't expected, someone she thought was miles away. "I need to talk," the visitor said, eyes darting between her and him. Her heart skipped. Confusion, fear, and something else she couldn't name swirled inside her. "Here?" she asked cautiously. "Yes," the person said, urgency in their voice. "It can't wait." She felt his hand lightly brush hers, a fleeting, grounding touch. "We'll figure it out," he murmured, almost as if he knew the storm about to hit. The revelation came like a thunderclap. Emails, texts, and unspoken meetings, things she hadn't known existed, were now laid bare in the doorway. Secrets she thought were private, desires she thought were hers alone, had been shared in ways she couldn't have imagined. Her mind spun as the pieces fit together, exposing betrayals and confessions tangled in unexpected ways. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, she felt the pull of him again. Not in a reckless way, not in something forbidden or physical, but in the way he looked at her, unwavering and unflinching, a silent promise that he wouldn't let the storm destroy what they had. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, voice breaking with a mix of hurt and awe. "I wanted to protect you," he replied softly, eyes locking onto hers, fierce and sincere. "But some things can't stay hidden." For a moment, the room held its breath with them, the weight of truth and attraction pressing down, impossibly close and unbearably real. The world outside the door seemed to vanish. Every misstep, every secret, every unspoken word had led to this moment of raw vulnerability and honesty. And as the rain began to tap against the window, a quiet understanding passed between them, something had shifted irreversibly, and nothing could go back to the way it was. She turned back toward him, eyes wide, heart hammering, as the visitor spoke again, urgency sharp in their tone. What would happen next? The rain had stopped, but the tension it left behind hung in the air like a heavy curtain. She stood in the kitchen, glass in hand, still trembling from the revelations at the door. His presence was beside her, steady, grounding, and yet there was fire in his eyes, a determination she hadn't seen before. "I can't believe this," she whispered, voice tight with anger and hurt, the words spilling out faster than she intended. "All these secrets, all this time, you didn't trust me enough to tell me?" He ran a hand through his hair, jaw tight. "It wasn't about trust," he said, voice low but firm. "It was about protecting you, protecting us from things we weren't ready to face." Her chest heaved, a mix of frustration and relief fighting inside her. "And now? Do we just pretend it didn't happen?" "No," he replied, stepping closer. His gaze softened, yet the intensity remained. "Now we face it. Together." The air between them seemed to crackle, charged with the remnants of betrayal and the undeniable pull they'd tried so long to resist. Her anger flared, but underneath it was something more, something dangerous and thrilling, a desire to confront, to reconcile, to reach for what they both wanted but had hidden for so long. She set the glass down, fingers brushing his lightly in a tentative gesture. I don't know if I can forgive everything, she admitted, voice trembling. I don't expect you to, he said, eyes never leaving hers. But I do know that I can't pretend I don't feel this. Not for a second longer. The room seemed smaller, charged with a tension that was both electric and comforting. They stood close now, breaths mingling, hearts hammering, and yet the past hung like shadows in the corners, waiting to be acknowledged. She took a deep breath, gathering courage she didn't know she had. Then, we face it, she said, a hint of resolve in her voice. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at his lips. Together, he agreed. For a moment, silence reigned, not the tense silence of earlier, but one full of understanding, a fragile truce born of honesty and raw emotion. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't painless. But it was theirs. And that was enough for now. As the storm outside faded into distant echoes, she finally allowed herself to look at him fully, without pretense, without fear. Something unspoken passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement of desire, connection, and a bond forged in fire. The screen fades on her tentative smile mirrored by his steady gaze, leaving the audience with the promise that their story is far from over. The tension that had gripped them for weeks finally melted away in the quiet of the early morning. The kitchen, once charged with hesitation and unspoken desire, now felt like a sanctuary. She leaned against the counter, the soft glow of sunrise spilling through the window, painting everything in warm gold. He stood beside her, just close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating off him. No words were necessary at first. The silence between them was comfortable, gentle, a far cry from the charged silence of past nights. She let her hand brush his lightly, tentatively, and he intertwined his fingers with hers as if they had been meant to fit that way all along. I was so afraid, she whispered, voice soft, almost afraid it might break the fragile peace. I know, he replied, squeezing her hand gently. Me too. But we're here now. Together. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had endured: jealousy, secrets, longing, and risk. And yet, despite the chaos of the past, there was a promise in the way he looked at her, steady, sincere, and unwavering. She finally let herself smile, a real smile, unburdened by doubt or fear. He mirrored it, a small, tender curve of his lips that made her heart flutter in ways she hadn't realized it could. Slowly, naturally, they leaned toward each other, foreheads resting together, breathing in the quiet intimacy of the moment. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand gesture, no sudden declaration, just two people finally allowing themselves to be seen, understood, and accepted. The warmth between them was comforting, thrilling, and entirely theirs. I've wanted this for so long, she admitted, eyes closing for just a heartbeat. And I've wanted you, he said, softly, a hint of laughter in his voice. More than I ever thought I could. The morning light continued to spill over them, golden and forgiving, washing away the remnants of doubt and fear. For the first time, the future felt possible, not just a fragile hope, but a shared reality. And in that shared space, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. As they stood there, hands entwined, hearts beating in quiet harmony, the camera fades slowly, leaving viewers with the lingering sense of warmth, connection, and a love that had survived the storm.